In this video, I show you what the best undercoating is when you're using washes and contrast colors. Before we get into today's video, I just want to give a huge thanks to all of you who responded to my previous video where I made a special appeal to support Alex, who created Dungeon Crawl, which can be used as an alternative rule set to Hero Quest. So many of you responded and went ahead and purchased his $15 files, and I want to thank you so much for doing that. Special shout out to Andrew Knight, who had already bought the game but bought it again and is contributing that second copy to be an additional draw prize, so that instead of one winner, we're going to have two winners at the end of this month. All you have to do is subscribe to my channel and make a comment in that video, so go ahead and check that out here. This introduction is pretty long, and so if you just want to skip to the section that goes into the experiment, go ahead and use the timeline below to skip ahead. If you've seen any of my previous painting tutorials, you know that my favorite current method is to use a white rattle can and base coat everything white, and then using one coat of contrast colors to paint my miniatures. That has made my miniature painting super efficient and really fast, getting really good results. But one of the criticisms that I've heard from people regarding contrast colors is that it makes the miniature too, what I say, pastel-y, without, ironically, enough contrast in the actual paint. And so sometimes you don't get very good results, or you get results like these miniatures here from Barnacle Bay, where it does look a little bit cartoonish and you're not seeing enough of shading from the actual colors. And these are larger models, and therefore I think you're going to notice it a lot more. Now, in a number of other models, I think just the contrast colors looks fine. So if you look at these guys here, they actually look fine with just the contrast colors. And these miniatures that have a lot of natural texture to them, I think looks fantastic. If you look at my Warcry videos, I think these things look amazing, considering that I didn't go back and do any highlighting. But just by using contrast colors with a base coat of white, you can get some fantastic results, especially if the textures are organic and you're using the browns in the set. I would never use contrast colors with a lot of flat surfaces like Space Marines. I think contrast colors look terrible on Space Marines. Again, if you go back here, take a look at this Bat Sorcerer, and it just really is lacking any kind of shading, and it really looks like a watercolor painting without a lot of depth. If you take a look instead at these heroes from the same game, the method that I used here is more traditional, where I spray painted it black and then layered colors on top of it. And because of that, you get really great shading, and more importantly, you get black lining, where there is a lot of contrast between the different colors that are on here. But obviously the traditional method of layering is going to take a lot more time. Because of COVID-19 delays in shipping, all of my Kickstarter games are all going to be delivering in the next 7 months. And this includes a large number of miniatures that will be coming my way. I went all in on Arena the contest, and so with that game alone, I'm going to be receiving about 300 miniatures. So my question is there a way to maintain the efficiency of using contrast colors but providing a little bit more shading? Is it going to be worth it to add some extra steps to provide shading? So the three methods that I'm going to be exploring really is going to be maintaining my traditional method, which is just spray painting with white, which is really efficient. The other two options is doing zenithal highlighting. The first option using an airbrush, and then the third option is doing zenithal highlighting with a traditional brush. Now, I've had an airbrush for a couple of years now, but I've only used it once or twice, and I found the whole process of cleaning to be so cumbersome that I really didn't pick it up again. But for the sake of these hundreds of miniatures that are going to be coming, I'm going to dive back in trying to use the airbrush to do traditional zenithal highlighting. So I'm clearly not an expert, but I'm going to go ahead and try with this experiment and see what it looks like. And then the third method of just brushing on some white on top of black with a traditional brush is for those of you who don't have an airbrush and don't want to invest in an airbrush. And one of the downfalls, I think, of using an airbrush is you're losing all of the black lines in the face, or some of the details that are on the upper part of the body that you want to maintain. And so my thinking is by using a brush, you can keep all of those dark lines that are here because it's not just being washed out by the spray that's going all over the miniature. So those are the three methods that I'm going to be experimenting with, and I'm going to be using the Forbidden Fortress miniatures in order to go ahead and see what results are going to be the best and how much time it takes to add zenithal highlighting. So let's go ahead and dive in. Here's my Badger Patriot 105. I pulled it out of storage and I'm using it here for the first time in a long time. And as you can see, I went ahead and spray painted 2 models in white and then a couple more in black. And here I'm just spraying with my airbrush the white zenithal. And as you can see, it's just at one angle from top down so that I'm preserving the dark areas underneath as shadows. So it took me some time to try to figure out the right consistency. I've heard on other channels that it needs to be the consistency of milk, skim milk, and so I actually had to water down my Badger paint to be even more watery. And I'm using about 15 psi, maybe 20 psi to spray out this coat. And I'm slowly layering it on top, and this is what it looks like. I went ahead and grabbed the Tengu and sprayed it similarly. Now I'm going to grab some titanium white. Again, I just use craft paint and use this brush to pull down just one direction with this brush. And I'm using a pretty coarse horsehair brush, but you can use a softer brush if you want the fade to be softer. So this is a little bit harsh, but the reason why I like the stiffer brush is because it prevents the paint from going into the crevices. So I'm basically dry brushing on top. And using a brush actually gives me more control than the airbrush. And here you see the difference between the traditional zenithal highlighting with the airbrush on the left and then using a regular brush on the right. And as I mentioned before, using a regular brush really does preserve the lines that's in the face or anything that's on top. I mean, look at the hair. I still have black lines and shading in the hair, whereas with the airbrush that's hard to maintain. And the face as well, you can see lines in the face on the right, whereas with the airbrush, it is a little washed out. I mean, look right above the lip, see how it's washed out on the left, but on the right, you still are maintaining a lot of the shading and shadows. Same thing with the Tengu. Here's a comparison side by side, and obviously the Tengu to the right maintains a lot more dark spots than on the left. Although when you look at the feathers here, they're about the same. So I'm not losing a ton of detail on the left because I kept my airbrush angled pretty high up. And here we have a shot of all 3 different methods. And you can see some of the differences before we're going to apply the paint on top. So we're going to go ahead and apply the contrast colors. I'm not going to walk through all of the steps, but just show you really briefly. Here it is, putting it on the all white undercoat and just being careful not to get it onto other parts of the model, which is the trick with contrast colors. And then here with the airbrush zenithal, and then this is the zenithal using a brush. The method of putting on the paint is the same. So here are the results, and as you can see, there is a difference. This is the method with just white undercoat, and it looks a little bit pastel-y, although it's fairly passable, I think. I don't think it's that bad. The red I was worried was going to be just a little bit too watercolory, but on the Tengu it looks good too. And then this is the airbrush version of zenithal, and there's definitely more shadows and shading. When you're looking at that Oni, you can definitely see the dark parts underneath. And then finally, this is the brushed zenithal, and as you can see, it is much more contrast between dark and light because of the brush creating much harsher lines between the dark and the light, whereas the airbrush obviously is a more gradual fade. And let's compare these Tengu together. And I don't think the one on the left is that bad. but it is clear using zenithal, you will get more of a contrast and much darker shadows. So I do think that it does look better to do the zenithal, even though it's an added step and will add time. Now between these two, I actually do like the less harsh gradations in the airbrush zenithal versus the paintbrush to the right. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Oni and basically see that I do like the two on the right over the pure white undercoat here on the left, because there is much more gradation of shade, and so it makes the model look a little bit more realistic rather than like a watercolor. But here I'm a little bit surprised. I thought I would like the brushed on zenithal better because it maintains some of the lines in the face, but I do like the more gradual shading of the airbrush. So I am actually preferring the airbrush version, even though you lose some of those dark lines in the upper portions of the model. So overall, I think I'm surprised that I do like the airbrush zenithal better than the brushed zenithal. And if you look here on the back, you can see some of the differences in gradation and shading as well. And obviously it all depends on how you're doing the shading or the zenithal highlighting. I'm still a novice at using the airbrush, so hopefully I can improve and have a little bit more control. But you know, if you don't have an airbrush, I think using a traditional brush with zenithal works well too. So take a look at these and see which of these options that you like. But I'm actually surprised that I like the airbrush version the best out of these three options. So here is the completed base set, and I do have these Kickstarter exclusive sumo heroes that are added as well. And as you can see, I do think that the zenithal highlighting does add that extra level of shading. That does make it look a lot better. Now, I did use just traditional painting for this statue. I didn't do zenithal highlighting. I just base sprayed this a copper and then used a wash to get that green in there. But everything else I did use zenithal highlighting. Also with these guys, these skeleton samurai, I did spray a little bit of purple on them and then lightened it up with a very light coat of white on top. So that did create an efficiency in painting these guys, where all I had to do was go back and highlight with this gold color and the sash with this tan. So these guys were super fast using that method. And I do think that you can really tell a difference with the zenithal on this sumo wrestler. You can see the shading on his body with the darker areas underneath. Also in the robes and the folds, you can see the darker areas in this hero character as well. But the area where I think you can notice the most is with these worm things, where underneath you see the darker areas and the obvious highlighting from the zenithal on top. And this was super simple to paint. Once I did the zenithal, all I did was just one coat of the orc green on this and the red right here, and then highlighting the teeth with white, and I was done with that. So these were super fast. Of course, without the zenithal, I would have done that method anyway, but it does provide that extra layer of shading that's underneath these worms that would otherwise be just a monochrome one color of green with very little shading. So in models like this, you do notice a lot. And with these Oni characters, again, I think the difference is pretty marked between the two. And then also an efficiency, obviously, that I can do is to not spend as much time doing the basing of all of these models. But because I've done all of my previous Shadows of Brimstone models with this basing, I wanted to keep it consistent with all of these guys. If you haven't seen my video showcasing all of these painted miniatures for Shadows of Brimstone, go ahead and click up here. But overall, I'm really happy that I did this experiment to see what the differences were. So after seeing these results, what are my conclusions? So clearly, I do think that the zenithal highlighting with an airbrush does look the best aesthetically. The amount of shading and highlighting that is provided by the airbrush along with the gradation in that highlighting looks the most natural and looks the best. And if you don't have an airbrush, I do think that using a regular brush to do highlighting is a viable option. But at the end of the day, I think the question is it worth the added time to do the zenithal in order to get the bump up in aesthetic quality? And at this moment, as I anticipate having all of these games come in, I think my conclusion is no. The amount of time that it would take to do brush highlighting and even the efficiency of using an airbrush, which isn't that bad, at this point doesn't warrant the additional time that it takes. And at this point, I think probably the most efficient is to go back to the white spray primer and just doing one coat of contrast colors. But what I'm going to do is commit to trying out the airbrush, and possibly that will help me become more efficient in being able to use it. I'm still trying to figure out the proper thinning technique and what to use and how to use my airbrush. So maybe once I get those procedures down, my workflow will be faster and I won't find it quite as cumbersome to use the airbrush. So I will go ahead, and I have probably another 100-150 miniatures for Forbidden Fortress to paint up. And so hopefully by the end of this project, I'll know whether or not I'm going to stick with the airbrush or whether or not I'm going to go back to just using the white spray primer. I do know that a lot of you who do watch my painting tutorials, you don't have an airbrush. So fortunately, even if I do prime my miniatures with zenithal highlighting with an airbrush, you can still use the painting technique regardless of what your undercoating is. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Also check out my Patreon page to see what the GGGG is for this month. For October of 2020, the GGGG is the board game The Few and the Cursed, and 3 additional Patreon supporters will also be chosen to be receiving the printed copy of Dungeon Crawler. So if you want in on that action, go ahead and check out my Patreon page. Otherwise, thanks so much. Happy painting, happy gaming, and we'll see you next time.